Thank you all for coming. Music reviews have become fewer in number. Over the years, we've seen the cultural pages of newspapers disappearing. And I think all of us here can speak to that. But it is a great loss. And why do you think it is a loss? Deepa, could you tell us about The Hindu? Deepa was deputy editor of the cultural pages at The Hindu for 20 years? Yeah.
Music reviews have lesser and lesser space. In fact, art reviews, anything related to culture has very little space in mainstream newspapers. And I don't think newspapers are to be blamed for this singularly. I think it's part of a larger phenomenon. I think the rise of YouTube, where people could sit at home and listen to any art form or participate in any art form, was perhaps one of the reasons. And then social media, where people could, look at posts and write. And newspapers themselves started online newspapers where they ran blogs, and Hindu ran a blog called Threads, where you could practice long form. And print, they were not giving that much space in print. So I don't think newspapers took this decision overnight to cut down writing space on art, but it was part of a larger social phenomenon.
Do you think business is becoming more important somehow, trade and business, rather than the cultural pages of a newspaper, which we all grew up on? Karl, you have you wrote for Time Out London. You had a Western classical music column for 8 years or more. And one day I went to London, and suddenly Time Out was this slim little thing with ads in it, and all of the wonderful journalism was gone. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was that time when everything was going online, and suddenly they had to make decisions about how many people they could be employing, how many editors and so on, and suddenly, instead of music editors for each different section of pop, Western classical, etc., they ended up with just one editor for all music. And of course that inevitably narrowed the options down. But I think the bigger problem with that, obviously you've just mentioned, we do have online reviewing, whether it's individuals on YouTube or various spaces that still do reviews. I think our big problem is that we forget that a great deal of cultural criticism, music criticism in my case, is about taste formation. It is about guiding views and viewers and thinkers in my field. Someone like Robert Schumann, was one of the great tastemakers of his time, trying to eschew the common and the cheap and trying to bring in the important and saying this is actually not just a cheap entertainment but an important art form. And I think as soon as we spread ideas across the internet, it's wonderfully empowering, of course, that everybody has a voice, and that is marvelous in many ways. But of course, one can only move towards averages and not have a general taste-making direction. And equally, we don't absolutely have the background of the speaker. Where's that person coming from? Do we trust them? Whereas previously, when you followed whoever it was for 8 or 10 or 12 or 30 years, you knew exactly their point of view, their cultural outlook, and you could decide that wasn't yours, or it was yours, and you could go with that and see the world through those eyes, particularly the bits of the world you hadn't had a chance to go to in that theatre piece or that concert.
Ramjee, do you want to add to that?
The points that, Deepa, that you made about the economics of the publishing industry, and you're talking about the whole business of what is happening to reviewing in general, my views are both. I mean, both of them are accurate. Let me, therefore, just give you my personal example. There was a point at which my company, Explosity, was publishing something like 19 editions of different publications every month in 3 countries. And when the subprime crisis happened, that's when it happened, and that tsunami took a while to get to India, it resulted in us shutting down every single one of our print publications, totally. There wasn't any point in sitting there and trying to fool people with it. And I'm saying it's justifiable because chopping trees, pulping them, turning them into print magazines is hardly the most efficient way to disseminate information in the age of the internet. And now that has grown in so many different ways. So you know what? there was a joke that I have printing ink in my bloodstream. Now it's all wasted because there's no point in being there. The whole thing is that as it goes on, there's a reason why all of these things happen. So what moved online? There should have been a point where a lot of what was consumed in print was consumed online. The biggest difference, very quickly, is that while print necessarily was curated by an editor who selected what would fit in the limited spaces, online's the Wild West, everything goes. So did fragmentation cause a loss of interest in people understanding how critique should develop? Like Karl was saying, you talked about you follow a certain critic, and then you develop a relationship with this critic over a period of time. That seems to have gone. It's not just for music, it's for everything else. You don't know who the biggest movie critic is and so on. It doesn't really matter because it's quite fragmented. And that's the way we're processing everything that is told to us. Personally, I think there's a scope for curation, but I really think that it's like something breaking into a million pieces, and it's all going to come together in some form or the other. But honestly, after some 3 decades of being in the publishing business, I would not be able to hazard a guess as to the nature of that beast that's coming in.
So, of course, a great loss in general to the culture of music, the musical culture of a place. So, what are the ingredients of a good music review?
As both Karl and Ramjee were saying, a good review is informed, and this, when I say informed, it comes over a period of time. You listen to music, and like we were having this discussion, does a reviewer also need to know the art form? The reviewer definitely has to know the art form, otherwise you're unable to follow the intricacies, technicalities of the art form. So I'm not sure if there is a standard definition of what a good review is, but I can say this. No art form is born in vacuum. So every art is subjected to social, economic, political changes. Art is never born in vacuum. It's shaped by society. So when you're listening to a piece of music, you should have an understanding of space, time, history, and geography. And where the musician comes from, where the art form comes from, and the journey of the art form itself is something that has to show up in a good review. A good review is also, for instance, let me talk about music. What would you say is a good review? Recognition of a raga, does that make a good review? As an editor of a cultural magazine, I have seen so many reviews that are unusable. Why? Because the review, at the outset, the review looks perfect. They would have identified the ragas, they know the bandish, they know the tala in which the bandish has been set. But does that give you, the reader, an experience of music? It hardly gives you the experience of music. So a good review is something that should be able to capture the context of the art form, and as well translate all the technicalities into a kind of experience. When I talk about music, I won't say that Marva is a hexatonic raga and it doesn't move in this fashion. I'm not translating my experience of listening to Marva to my reader. So a good review should be able to capture the experience. It should be able to also understand the creative process of an artist.
Absolutely, I entirely agree with you, Deepa. I would add one thing. You probably would have added it if I hadn't passed the mic to me. I think there probably needs to be something that is also universal about explaining that moment. In music criticism, your big problem is you can't go back. Oh, that was a great concert, I want to go and hear it. Of course, on YouTube we often can, and you might do now. But that idea of, okay, I've captured the essence of this one ephemeral moment, it's gone. What can we all gain or learn from that is very important. And that might be, you might want to go back and hear that kind of an artist, but it might be much broader. Oh, I see some changes happening in the air, and there's a general trend going this way or that way. And I think a really good review also attends to some of those elements so that it can be beyond just a history of a moment, and it can be a cultural milieu that is being sketched. And again, when we look at the best crits in Western music of particularly the late 19th century, early 20th century, we study them very closely because we're not very interested in how so-and-so played. That's long gone. But actually what people are saying about it and how things are just changing, or indeed what someone is saying is about how this person is different from the norm, and that might be at that time good or bad, is really, I think, the thing. And so that universalizing of the specific into the general is, I think, probably one of the really useful things of a good review. What about you, Ramjee?
That's very well said. I really, both of them together. To summarize, to this, not that I need to, but it sets it up for my, segues it into my what I have to say. What you're looking for from a reviewer is opinion, which is the icing on the cake of knowledge and information. And this is what you're looking for. And then you get a chance to compare it with your own views. Like Karl said, you can't go back and listen unless you're listening to an album that has been launched. Yet, but as far as the reviewer is concerned, when you talked about developing a relationship, I just want to give you an anecdote. And I have nothing to add to what they have said. There was a reviewer of Carnatic music back in the 80s. His name was Subudu. And you remember his name? Yeah. And I know him through family connections and so on. And Subudu was the terror of the Music Academy Festival every year in Madras. And such a terror that once all the musicians got together and paid for posters from the airport to the Music Academy saying, Subudu, spare us. All right? Now here's what, it is true. Here's what Subudu did. Now, a man of this stature, he used to work for the Statesman because everyone needed a job. And he was music reviewer, Statesman. He was based in Delhi. And one day the editor, cultural editor, were you a cultural editor? All right, somebody like her, I guess. But called Subudu and said, the Sri Lankan police drummers are performing at Talkotara Stadium, go cover it. Subudu was enraged. He was completely outraged. He says, what do you want me to cover this? And he says, yes. Do your job. I'm ordering you as your editor to go and do it. So Subudu said, fine. His review, which in my opinion is the best review, the next morning in the papers, was very journalistic. It said, the Sri Lankan police drummers performed at the Talkotara Stadium last night. They went on a lathi charge. To my mind, that's the best review of music I've ever heard.
I also feel that the ecosystem of a artist-listener relationship has gone. I have read and I've heard from a lot of connoisseurs of music and musicologists that how the past masters would want certain people in their audience who would give them valuable criticism. For instance, Bhimsen Joshi would bring a retinue of friends and would place them in the first few rows and look at them when he started off. You know, there was a certain eye contact that they could establish and they could immediately tell if they were on the right track or on the wrong track. And I remember Bhimsen Joshi going to this great poet, Dattatreya Ramchandra Bendre's house that night when he did very badly in a concert and wept before Bendre because Bendre was highly knowledgeable about music, went and asked Bendre, where did I go wrong? You know, so this kind of ecosystem where an artist is nurtured by society and an artist would like to get feedback from a society is completely lost. Today, I think newspapers are in the business of icon making. So they want icons. They want to, only icons are covered. For instance, T.M. Krishna, an artist like T.M. Krishna or Ustad Rashid Khan, who are huge crowd pullers and are celebrated, very popular among public, they will get coverage in a newspaper. But for instance, Ustad Raghunandan Panchikar or someone like Vidwan A.S. Murli won't get that coverage, though they are equally musicians of equal caliber. So I think today we are in the process of icon making and newsmakers. We want newsmakers rather than musicians. So I think that whole ecosystem of where a reviewer is valued is gone.
Can I just add very quickly also to add exactly to your point, Deepa? I think in the icon making of modern reviewing, we forget sometimes to absolutely pan something. And again, in the old days, a crit would come out and say, this is terrible. And sometimes they would do it excoriatingly, or sometimes they would do it amusingly, but you were allowed to say bad things and say, this is terrible, it's rubbish, particularly of a great artist, because it wouldn't particularly affect them, and it's not like it would change their sales the next day because they're in the next city. And we've, as far as I can tell, we've lost that entirely. No one ever says anything other than something slightly mealy-mouthed. No one gives 1 or 0 star reviews anymore. And I think that's actually a great shame, because then we can't trust the good ones. And I think that's also part of that balance, isn't it?
So there is always this question of the editor asks you to cover a Balmurali Krishna concert, an icon in, or you go to Vijay Prakash's concert. And if they perform badly that day, what are you going to say? No, your editor will not take a bad review. And I know of hundreds of such instances when people wrote to our editor-in-chief and said, how can she write this? There are concerts where even basic tenets of music were not matched. And music is an art that's not the same every day. An artist cannot perform the same every day, and he's very vulnerable to many things. And an artist doesn't have the caliber to accept that anymore, I think. And therefore, like they were discussing in a session, my friend Akshara was saying in the morning, in a session on literary criticism, that today we are more politically correct. So reviews have lost their luster. It's lackluster because we are politically correct.
But how destructive do you want to be? I mean, if it's an amateur performer, or if it's a young person who's just coming up, you know, I've seen it happen where a really bad review can...
No, absolutely. In fact, most of the reviewers I know won't generally review a young artist, because it's just not fair, because they're making their way, they're finding their route, and if one does review them, and particularly if it's a cautious review or something, you are restricting future experiment, you're restricting dangerous kind of performances that may sometimes work and sometimes not. You are restricting creativity. I think that's certainly the case. But if any of you are particularly interested, there is a great book of really terrible criticism called the Dictionary of Musical Invective, or the Lexicon of Musical Invective, collated by Nicholas Leminski, and it's all the worst reviews ever, and it's the worst reviews of Beethoven Fifth Symphony and Brahms Second Symphony and all these iconic works. And of course, there's always some critic who just hated it. And I'll pass this on in a moment. I'll just take this moment for my favorite review story, that Max Reger, the German composer, had received a terrible, terrible review. And he just wrote a letter to the paper that had issued this review, and they published it. And it just said, "Dear sir, I am currently sitting in the smallest room of my house. Your review is in front of me. It will soon be behind me."
But Deepa, you're right about the ecosystem. In a situation right now, and I can speak for some American papers I'm familiar with, the arts section of the New York Times and so on, top to bottom, they're filled with people who understand the arts. Even if it's not their particular discipline, they get it. And it's going to be informed at every point in time. We don't have that in India. You have anyone who reviews anything, any editor who has no knowledge of what to receive, etc. Again, a quick thing, there's, some years ago, I was asked to buy a paper in Bangalore, leading paper in Bangalore, barely English language newspaper in Bangalore, so they positioned themselves. They called me and said, go review Louis Banks' Jazz Festival. So I said, sure, I'd love to. So I went in there, hated it. So I came back, and my title of the piece was Jazz, all right? And I wrote over there, I mean, I thought I wrote a fairly fair thing to say that, listen, you know, either their hearts were in it, minds were not in it, whatever it was, this wasn't jazz. It didn't swing, it didn't do whatever jazz is supposed to do. And then the review didn't come out the next day, so very timorously and tentatively, I don't normally do it, but I was curious. Call them. The sub-editor comes on the line. He says, we got your review. Who are you to talk about this? I said, You asked me. That's who I am. So just to your point, yes, ecosystem, we lack it.
I remember once when I went to meet this film music composer Anu Malik. He's very big. But at one point in his career, he was charged with plagiarism. And of course, he refuted the charges, but later he had to disappear from the music scene for a couple of years. So I went to meet him when the charges were leveled against him and before he quit the music industry for a brief period. And I asked him this. I said, so there are these charges of plagiarism on you, and I gave him whatever the example, cited it for him. He was very offended. And he said, I think you're very old-fashioned. He said, this is common. Don't you know something that, don't you know a tune bank? So we all take from there. We all, that's not called copying. You must be very old-fashioned, he said. And I argued a bit. And finally, he came back to me and he said, I can tell. I was wearing an Assamese overcoat, an Indian handloom overcoat. And he said, I can tell from the way you dress that you're pretty old-fashioned in your views.
Well, you said that the New York Times, in general, the reviewers, I think when it comes to jazz and blues and classical music, they're fine. But if you look at their reviews of Indian classical music or the visiting artists from India, I've seen some really ridiculous reviews of Bharatanatyam or, Carnatic music. Anyway, one can't know everything, I guess. So what are the particular challenges of writing about music in general? I think, Karl, you often say that writing about music is like dancing about architecture. So, and in your particular genre, what are some of the challenges?
I think in the Western music genre, you stole my quote, of course, I was going to use that one. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, what do words actually mean at all when you're trying to describe any kind of musical event, maybe how it made you feel? So I think particularly in Western music, one of the big twofold problems. One, we're generally talking about a very long stream of music. You might be listening to a Mahler symphony that lasts 90 minutes. How are you going to capture much of that in a few hundred words? You're probably not going to do a very good job. You're going to pinpoint 2 or 3 things, and that's already problematic. And then the point where in Western music the criticism is really useful is in a new work. A new opera or a new symphony comes out, and we all want to know how, and we can't get up to Edinburgh or go to Paris or whatever. We want to know what's happening. But of course, again, it's so hard to place that because it's new, because probably it's doing something that hasn't been done before, and it's the first hearing. And you might, if occasionally one does see the reviewers with pre-publication scores, and they're going through, and sometimes one sees them at rehearsals, really trying their best to kind of get what's going on. But the one thing you know is that at the first performance, it is exceedingly unlikely that anyone will really work out how this fits in and how this has taken the art form forward, or if it doesn't. And it's very, very hard to tell. So I think that's, for me, one of the really big difficulties of writing those reviews, just kind of finding the zeitgeist to fit that in against.
Jazz, it's supposedly easier to do, but like every single form of music has its own language, its own grammar. And jazz, the grammar of jazz, the way that you look at it, I'm going to get into that, but it evolved in the 1940s around Charlie Parker. It's called bebop, and that is the defining grammar of jazz. So with jazz musicians, when we look at someone and say, yeah, he knows jazz, generally speaking, you know that he's rocking whatever it is that was defined and developed towards the 40s, the 50s, and towards the early 60s. So when you go to a review, and then let's say I'm starting to review a piece of music, I have a lot of challenges in my mind. But the biggest challenge, we've been slagging on editors and publications, the receiving end of it, the audience. So when I start to write it, I have trouble constructing my prose with who am I writing for, right? And what am I going to say that's going to be understood? Shall I just Shall I just write whatever it is I want to write, be true to what I'm supposed to do, and be as technical as possible within reasonable confines? What if even that is not going to be understood because my readership lacks the knowledge to be able to receive anything I say? And this, to me, is the biggest challenge. But then, it challenges me, and I like it from writing it from a prose standpoint and said, all right, just challenge the writer in me, let me do what I want. But at some point in time, I just have to say, stop. I'm just going to put it out there. The readers get what they want out of it. I don't know if that's your experience as well.
I'm actually very nervous each time I write a music review. I kind of spend a couple of sleepless nights before I actually write, because it's a huge thing to translate something that's very abstract into concrete, and make that concrete abstract for whoever is reading it. So it's always, and if I can't recreate that experience that I've had by listening to that concert, what is the use of writing? I'm just wasting editorial space. So these are questions that always bother me. And how do I translate something that's, there are certain canons in all forms of music. How do I break that canon into bits of experience to someone who's reading my review? For instance, there's something called Deshaditalam in Carnatic music, which is no longer in use. But suppose in a concert, someone presents it as a very special piece. How do I tell my readers the kind of experience that listening to that antique piece gave me? So now I have thought a lot about this, and I usually try and borrow an example from popular music to try and make people understand what I'm trying to talk about. For instance, there is this film called Michael Madan Kamarajan, and in which there is a song called Sundari Neenu. It was a very popular song which used the Deshaditalam. So when I have to, in case I have to talk about something like this, I invoke a more popular example to convey the classical. So and there are these standard ways in which music reviews are written. My endeavor is to constantly break that pattern. If I don't break that pattern each time, I will fall into that rut. So each time I try and find a new way of writing about music or art, whatever, at hand. I'm not saying that I'm entirely successful, but that's my endeavor. My endeavor is to translate whatever I have received from listening to that piece of music to whoever reads it.
So just one final round before we opened up for questions. Anecdotes, your best review, your worst review.
No.
Encounters with musicians.
Oh golly, the most extraordinary but prescient example of a very interesting review was when the great violinist, composer, and in fact teacher of Menuhin, Enescu, what was happening? He was playing the piano that night because his student was playing the violin, and so he said he would accompany him. And he just had afternoon tea with his very dear friend, Dinu Lipatti, who was one of the greatest pianists of the 20th century. So he said, well, would you mind page turning for me? So there was student violinist playing the concert and very famous violinist and pianist playing the piano, and Dino Lipatti, very famous pianist, page turning. And I'd seen the review, and it just said, a very curious concert happened last night. The person playing the piano should have been playing the violin. The person turning the pages should have been playing the piano. And the person playing the violin should have been turning the pages.
I can't cap that story, so I'm not going to try. But recently, when Harry Belafonte died, The Wire asked me to write an obit for him, basically. So I was researching it, trying to find out stuff that I didn't know about Harry Belafonte. And I did not know that when he started his career, he first started his career as a jazz singer. And I was surprised by this. I said, okay, let me dig in a little more. And then I found out that on his first day, on his first gig, because someone found him singing in a musical somewhere, I can't remember exactly what performance it was, But nonetheless, they called him and said, hey, would you like to come to this jazz club and sing? And do you know standards? And he says, yes, I know standards. And so they said, all right, so come along and have a sing over the I'm going to be a jazz singer. So he goes to the jazz club, and there on the stage, as his accompanists, are Charlie Parker and Miles Davis. That was his last performance in jazz.
I've just met some of the finest musicians, and I want to remember some of them. The way they prepared me, the way they taught me everlasting lessons. For instance, I met Ustad Fariduddin Dagar Saab, the senior of the Dagar Bandhu. He is no more. He passed away 15 years ago. I met him at the Drupad Foundation, and he was taking class that morning. And I walked in to talk to him, and I was full of trepidation meeting the great master. And he asked me a few questions before I could start talking to him. So he asked me, what is your engagement with Hindustani? Do you know the Khyal? Have you studied the Khyal form? All this he asked me. And then before he started talking to me, he said, I'm going to tell you a story. And he said, see, recently I went to Paris to teach my student. One of my students lives in Paris, and I went there to teach him. And as soon as I entered that house, I couldn't bear to be there. I had to first clean the house. The house was full of a smell of spices that were not Indian, he said. I had to clean the house. I took 2 days to clean the house and set up the kitchen. And then I started cooking, and then I started Drupad practice, is what he said. So what he was trying to tell me is, now, if you have any other influences, just get rid of them before you start talking to me. First clean your head and then start talking to me. This is something that, that I always remember, that whoever I go to meet, I should abandon my prejudices or where I come from, not carry the baggage that I have, abandon it, and then go and meet the artist. I have similarly, I have many such examples, and I guess one should keep it for another day, but I remember Dagar Saab very fondly for saying something so important to me, to abandon my prejudice, to abandon the baggages of modern life that I, carried, and listen to music with, a mind that is rid of all prejudices, something that I remember always.
If I may, there's another student of Fariduddin Dagar in Drupad over here, the jazz singer Radha Thomas. She's with us in the audience.
Thank you for those wonderful stories. You mentioned the obituary, the obit, and I've found that some of the best reviews of musical works, of a musician's life, are in obits. Any comments on the genre of the obit?
Do you really have to wait for me to die before criticizing me in my muse? It does, doesn't it?
And of course, the law says that you cannot slander or libel the dead, so you can say whatever you like at that point.
They can't contradict you.